Better decisions, fewer regrets. Y'all make great decisions this week, right? Okay, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. Okay, I grew up going to camp. Okay, I grew up going to a church camp down in Georgia called Woodland, right? I grew up going to this camp. I knew every inch of this camp. There was one night, maybe not my best decision, but me and a group of my friends, we decided that we were going to sneak out of the cabin and just kind of have fun in the middle of the night, exploring. You know, we weren't going to do anything bad or damaging, right? But we were going to explore. And so, I've gone to this camp for years, and it's a large property, but I knew it like the back of my hand. The problem is that particular night, it was very dark. Like, and not just regular dark, but very dark. You know, one of those nights, the cloud cover is thick, and you can't even see by the moonlight. Well, I had a group of these guys with me. I'm the oldest and the most mature, of course. And so we're all exploring around. We end up in this area of woods, and you couldn't see anything. And this was this trail that we were walking on. I knew I had been on this trail many times, but you know how it is. You can be somewhere that you're really familiar, but all of a sudden, when it's just pitch black dark, it's easy to get disoriented, right? You experienced that before? Well, we're walking along, and I could see way off in the distance, a street light that I knew was at the end of where we wanted to be. Yeah, and so this was at the very end of where we wanted to be. And so I just focused in on that light, and we're going, and we're feeling our way, but I couldn't see anything around me, and to the point that the guys that were with me we were kind of walking in a straight line, and we all had like a train. They had their hands on my shoulders and the next guy, and so on. And we're walking slowly and carefully. Well, I'm walking fairly confidently. I know this trail. And all of a sudden, I take a step, and the ground isn't there anymore. Okay? I'm not talking like I stepped into a tree. The ground's not there. I step off a ledge, and I fall, had to have been 30 feet. No, I'm just kidding. It was like 6 feet, though, for real. And I remember it was just one of those, I don't know if you've ever done, unexpectedly stepped off something, and there not being any ground there. And it was a free fall for a second, and then I fortunately landed on the ground in the middle of a creek. I had totally forgotten about this creek that was in the middle of the trail. And it was in a gully, and I had fallen off, and I dropped. Well, the first reaction I had was the guy behind me was my best friend, and ended up being my college roommate. He was bigger than me, believe it or not, back then. And he was bigger than me, so the first thing I thought was he's going to land on me. And so I just yell out, "Richie, stop!" And of course, he's like, "Where'd you go?" I'm down here. And of course, I had gotten so focused in on that light and was so sure of where I was going, I'd forgotten that there were dangers all around. I'd forgotten there were things I couldn't see that were going to trip me up, and they did. And I think we all do that sometimes. I think we find ourselves in a situation where we have a tendency to lock in on one thing that we can see, and we forget about or neglect to deal with the things we can't. Maybe especially the dangerous things. Last week I talked about confirmation bias. You know, how we take the information that agrees with what we've already decided and we ignore everything else. Well, I'm going to talk to you about another bias that we have, very similar to that one. It's called focalism. In focalism, what happens in focalism is somewhat similar, is you take the initial information you have, and that becomes the information that's guiding your emotions, that's guiding your decision making, and all you can see, and you tend to not be able to see any of the other information. You're so locked in on that one source of light that everything else fades into this blackness. Any other information, any other dangers you want to ignore because you've already decided based on that initial information that's what you're focused on. Focalism, like I said, is very similar to confirmation bias. Here's an example. This may or may not have happened to me at one point or another. But you walk into an Apple store. How many of you like to walk around the Apple store? Anybody like to do that? I like to walk. I kind of geek at all the stuff that I can't afford. I like it. And so I'm walking around, and hypothetically, a friend of mine was walking around in the Apple store and was looking at a MacBook Pro. And looking at it, and man, it has all the bells and whistles you want. This is a great machine. This would do. You've been wanting one for a long time. The only problem is you look at the price tag, and you realize it's $2,000 that you just don't have. Now here's focalism. Focalism is, I see this, it has everything I want it. I'm going to figure out how to make. Now, you got a salesperson working with you, right? This salesperson knows what happens if he allows you to walk out of the store without making a purchase. You're probably, as soon as you walk out of that store, you're going to come to your senses. The focalism's gone. And you're probably not going to make the regrettable decision of paying for something you can't afford. So he says, I tell you what, don't leave. I know you can't afford the $2,000, but how about this? I got a payment plan for the next 3 years. You can pay $100 a month, and you can have this computer. I can afford $100 a month. That sounds like a great idea. I'm completely ignoring the fact that I'm now going to pay $3,600 for a $2,000 computer. That's focalism, right? Have you ever fallen victim? You want something so bad you're willing to throw the common sense out. That leads us to making us, as reasonably intelligent people, regrettable decisions. There's a story in the Bible that I kind of want to get your thoughts going today as we talk about better decisions and fewer regrets. It's found in Acts chapter 5. It's about a husband and wife. And this story is always one of, this story scares me a little, to be honest with you. It's about a man and woman named Ananias and Sapphira. Now, I want to read this story to you, and then we'll talk just for a second about it. Let's take a look at it, verses 1 through 11. It says, Now a man named Ananias, together with his wife Sapphira, had also sold a piece of property. Now, just so you know what's going on, this was at a time when the church was first getting started, and people were excited, and thousands were coming to know the Lord and were joining the church, and it said that they were meeting each other's needs, and people were selling property and selling goods and things like that, and they were taking their money and they were all giving it to the church so it could be shared with people, and no one's needs were going unmet. You know, this was such a time in the church where people who had needs were having those needs met. And it was a very encouraging time. So Ananias and Sapphira sell this property. But it says this. It says, with his wife's full knowledge, he kept back part of the money for himself, but brought the rest and put it at the apostles' feet. Then Peter said, Ananias, how is it that Satan has so filled your heart that you have lied to the Holy Spirit and kept for yourself some of the money you received for the land? Didn't it belong to you before it was sold? And after it was sold, wasn't the money at your disposal? What made you think of doing such a thing? You have not just lied to human beings, but to God. And when Ananias heard this, he fell down and died. And great fear seized all who heard what had happened. Then some young men came forward, wrapped up his body, and carried him out and buried him. About 3 hours later, his wife, Sapphira, came in, not knowing what had happened. And Peter asked her, tell me, is this the price you and Ananias got for the land? Yes, she said, that is the price. And Peter said to her, how could you conspire to test the Spirit of the Lord? Listen, the feet of the men who buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out also. And at that moment, she fell down at his feet and died. Then the young men came in, and finding her dead, carried her out and buried her beside her husband. And understandably, great fear seized the whole church and all who heard about these events. Now, I don't plan on any of that happening here today, so don't worry. But here's the thing. The problem wasn't that Ananias and Sapphira, Peter acknowledged they owned the land. It was their money to do with as they pleased. The problem wasn't that they wanted to hold on to some for themselves. The problem was they tried to present it before the church and before God as if they were giving everything while they were holding something back. They were lying. Talk about a regrettable decision. They took a look at what could have been a great decision and a great story. I mean, what if they had decided and come forward and simply said, we've sold the land, and here's some of the money from this land that we want to bless the church with? That would have been a great decision that would have been able to, there would have been a celebration over that, but that's not how it went. They decided to present it differently. They lied. And they destroyed what could have been a great story with a lie. Guys, I want to start today, if you're filling in your outlines, with this. I want you to think about this. Our private decisions never remain private. They always end up impacting others. Our private decision, we spend so much time thinking we're making certain decisions, bad decisions, maybe, in private. Well, this isn't going to hurt anyone else. This is nobody else's business. Your private decisions never remain private. Your private decisions always end up impacting someone else. That's why I believe that the series we're doing right now is such a big deal. Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets, based on this book by Andy Stanley. And when I think he takes some questions, some opportunity to say, just pause. When you're making big decisions in your life, pause to consider the impact. Last week we talked about the integrity question. Am I being honest with myself, really? Or am I just telling myself what I need to hear so I can go do what I want to do? Am I just justifying what I think needs to be done, what I want to do, and trying to justify that to make it right? Am I being honest with myself? If we pause and ask ourselves that question, man, it could save a lot of regret. But today we're going to take a look at the second of 5 questions. It's the legacy question. It's the legacy question that says, what do I want my story to be? See, today we're going to say, as I stop, what do I want my legacy to be? When I'm making decisions in my life, what story do I want that life to tell? You see, the decisions you make today will forever be a part of the story of your life. The decisions you make today, the decisions you've already made, and the decisions you will make going forward, they're written in stone. They're there. They're decisions you've made. They're a part of your life. Stop when you're dealing with an important decision, when you're asking, when you realize that this is a crossroads of some kind. Sometimes it's a daily kind of thing. How am I going to live my life today? Sometimes it's bigger than that. Sometimes it's a life-changing, altering, course-changing kind of decision. Either way, stop. Consider the question, is this the story I want to tell? Is this the person I want to be? Imagine, let me give you a couple scenarios. Imagine you're in a situation where your boss comes to you. And your boss says, you're getting ready to deal with this client, and I need you to lie to them. This is the lie I want you to tell them. Now, you've got a hard choice to make, right? You can lie and do what your boss told you. You can be honest and face the consequences of disobeying your boss. Now, let's say you go to this client, and you've decided you're going to obey your boss, and you're going to tell the lie to the client. So you go and you have this interaction with your client, and your client calls you on it. Your client knows you're lying, calls you on it, throws you, and ditches your company. Gets back to your boss, and he throws you under the bus because you're the one that lied, not him, right? And you lose your job. Back up, and let's tell that story differently. My boss came to me, told me to lie, but I decide when I go to my client I can't do that, and I don't lie. My boss finds out I told him the truth, and I get fired anyway, right? Bad situation either way. It's a difficult spot to be in. You're between a rock and a hard place. But let me ask you this. What story do you want told about your life? Would you rather have the story told that you lied, that you're a liar? Would you rather have the story told that you did the right thing, even if it cost you something? You see, we come into situations all the time when we've got to stop and ask ourselves, what story do I want told here? I've got a choice. And it's an important one. Imagine another situation. You're engaged. Let's say you're a young man who's engaged. And there's a married woman at the office who's started paying some attention to you. You like the attention, and you flirt back, and you're kind of interested in it too. You've got a decision to make. If you decide to go forward and this leads to having an affair with this woman, yeah, the consequence might be that you've ended this relationship between you and your fiance, but consider it's bigger than that. Your private decision's not just a private decision. Her husband finds out and their marriage ends. They had 2 kids, and now their kids are living between 2 homes. Your decision had a lot more impact than just on you, didn't it? We find ourselves in these situations. Focalism says, that's what I want, and I'm going to try to figure out a way to make it happen, ignoring all these other things that are in the dark, in the fog, all these other decisions, all these other consequences, I should say. That's called regret. Here's the big question, guys. Are you willing to pause long enough to consider your story? As you're making decisions, whether it's the daily kind or the big kind, are you willing to pause? Are you willing to stop and ask the question, is this the story I want to tell? Today, we're going to, as we ask the legacy story, as we reflect, I want to look at someone. Now, we've looked at this guy before. You may know his story, maybe you don't, but you're going to hear just kind of a quick rundown on it. There's a man named Joseph that we find in the, not Jesus' dad, but a guy we find in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis. We see his story begin in Genesis chapter 37, then pick up in chapter 39, go all the way through chapter 47. It's a nice long story. But man, Joseph's a pretty amazing guy to take a look at because of his legacy, because of the decisions he made. And there are 4 things I want us to take from Joseph's story today. We're going to break his story down into 4 parts for you. And we're going to take a look at it. The first part, I'm just going to challenge you to this. Look for a Reuben. Go ahead and show that. What story do you want to tell? The first part of the story, go ahead and show it, is there it is. Look for a Reuben. I'm not talking about a sandwich with sauerkraut and all that stuff. Okay. We're talking about a man. You see, back and this story takes place. It's a man named Joseph. His dad was a man named Jacob, who God also named Israel. You see, from Israel came his sons, who were named, the 12 tribes of Israel were named from. That gives you kind of a historical context. Joseph was one of these sons. Joseph was the number 11 out of 12, I believe. Second youngest, okay? So Joseph, and here's the thing. Jacob had all these sons, and he had several different wives that he had sons, but he had a favorite wife. And I'll tell you that's his first mistake. Don't have a favorite wife, lesson number 1. But he had a favorite wife, Rachel. And Rachel, for a long time, couldn't have children. He had children through Leah. He had through some of their handmaidens and stuff. And back then, it was a different world. They did things differently. But he had these children. But Rachel finally conceives and has a kid. It's Joseph. And that was Jacob's favorite. You might have heard the story of the coat of many colors, because Jacob wanted to give his favorite son a beautiful gift. Well, his other brothers were understandably a little jealous of this. Now, to kind of speed this along, there was a point where Joseph was having these dreams. And these dreams were basically, just to kind of give you the summary, were about his brothers and his family one day bowing down to him. That was the interpretation of the dream that he was seeing. The brothers didn't like him very much. They had gotten to a place where they really didn't like Joseph. Well, one day Joseph had gone off, and he had seen his brothers goofing off out in the field working, and he brought back a bad report to his dad. Well, that didn't help either, because snitches get stitches, right? And so that's what happened here. And so they didn't like him very much. So Joseph one day is going back out. He's taking lunch to his brothers. His dad said, take your brother's lunch. He sees them out in the field, and they see him coming from a long way off. And they said, this is our opportunity, guys. No one will ever know. Let's kill him. Let's just murder him, and we'll tell Dad that he was attacked by a wild animal. Now, they had the oldest brother was named Reuben. And Reuben says, guys, maybe we shouldn't kill him. I'll tell you what, let's throw him in this cistern and let's figure out what we can do. And so there was this water cistern in the ground that they threw him in. And for some reason, Reuben wasn't with his brothers when what happened next takes place. As the brothers are standing there, they still want blood. And they see this group, this caravan of Ishmaelites coming, heading for Egypt. And they say, I tell you what, okay, if we're not going to kill him, if Reuben won't let us kill him, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. They'll take him away. So they sold him into slavery to the Ishmaelites, and they take him to Egypt. Reuben comes back to try to find his brother, wants to save him, but he's gone already, and he can't do anything about it. He's too late. Now here's where I want you to focus in on part one of the story. Look for a Reuben. You see, when you're trying to make a big decision in your life, there's not going to be much of a shortage of bad advice being offered. There are going to be all kinds of people that say, well, do what feels good. Do what feels right. You're never going to have a hard time finding a group of people that want to join you in seeking out blood, revenge in some way. If you're angry, it's easy to find a mob of people that will agree with you and be angry with you. But I want to tell you this, there's always going to be a Reuben if you will just look for them. If you will just take the time to listen. And think about Joseph's brothers. What if they had taken a moment to pause and said, you know, we're not really mad at Joseph. It's Dad's fault that he picked favorites. We're mad at him. Maybe we shouldn't take this all out on Joseph. But what if they had taken the time to say, we don't want murdering our brother or selling our brother into slavery. We don't want that to be our story, and that we lied to our dad and told him that he was attacked by animals. I don't want that to be a part of my story that's told for. They didn't have any idea this was going to be a story being told several thousand years later, but here we are. It's a part of their story. It's a story we're telling right now. You see, Reuben wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but he was the one willing to ask the questions that were bigger than the emotions of the moment. When you're making big decisions, big or small, there's going to be a Reuben in the room if you will pause and listen. Sometimes that Reuben might be your mom or dad or your spouse. Sometimes that Reuben might be one of your kids or a neighbor or a coworker, someone you trust, someone who's mentored you. Sometimes Reuben might be the Holy Spirit. Just simply pause and take a moment to listen for the voice that's going to rise above the emotions. But I challenge you, pause and listen when you're making a decision that can impact your life, that can impact others' lives. A decision that maybe you're emotional about or carries some risk of regret. Take a moment and look for a Reuben. Now here's part two of the story. As we continue looking at Joseph's story, part two is this. When things seem impossible, write a better story. We talked about the situation with the boss, right? When things seem impossible, make a decision that you're going to write a better story. Here's what happens next. Joseph is taken by this caravan of Ishmaelites to Egypt, and he's sold to a man named Potiphar. Potiphar buys Joseph, this Hebrew slave now. Now, Potiphar was the head of the royal guard for Pharaoh in Egypt. And so Pharaoh begins working in this household. Now, he's about 17, 18 years old when this happens. Now, imagine you've just been sold into slavery, and you are now being told you have to work in the household of this man who's part of the royal guard for the Egyptians. What do? What's your attitude like? What kind of actions do you take? Here's what Joseph does. Joseph said, here's the situation I'm in. I don't know why I'm in it. I'm not happy about it, but I'm going to work as hard as I can. I'm going to let God use me. I'm going to wait to see how God can use this situation. And he begins working hard. And he earns the favor of the other slaves. He eventually gets the attention of Potiphar himself, to the point that Potiphar begins to trust him with more and more responsibility, makes him the head of the household. No one was more powerful, more authoritative, might be the better word, in Potiphar's household than Joseph. He earned his trust. Now something happens along the way. Over about a 3-year period, Joseph's working for Potiphar. And one day, Potiphar's wife, while Potiphar was away, takes notice of Joseph. It says Joseph was a handsome man, well built, kind of like me. Potiphar's wife says, Joseph, come to bed with me. No. It says day after day she propositioned him and he refused. There came a point one day when he finally stops and he wants to ask her the legacy question. Mrs. Potiphar, stop and think about this for a minute. Is this the story you really want to write? That you gave up being married to one of the most powerful men in Egypt to sleep with a Hebrew slave? Is that the story you want to write? He says, I got to tell you, here I am as a Hebrew slave, and I do not want to dishonor my master who's trusted me with everything. I do not want to dishonor my God, who I think wants to use me somehow. And he flees, and what she does is she grabs hold of his cloak, and she accuses him of trying to rape her. Now, Potiphar has a choice. Who do I believe? Now, what it tells me, if I look at this story and I see if Potiphar didn't immediately kill this Hebrew slave for trying to rape his wife, it tells me that Potiphar didn't believe his wife. But he didn't really have a choice. So he has Joseph thrown into jail, thrown into this dungeon in the palace. So here Joseph is being thrown into jail for something he didn't do that Potiphar probably doesn't even believe that he did. But he's paying the price. Joseph had a choice, just like we do so often. We might be in a really difficult situation. We might feel like we're going to end up on the losing end. No matter what we do. If I fudge the numbers like my boss said and get caught, I get fired. If I don't, same. If I write a tithe check this week to the church, how am I going to pay my bills? But if I don't, what does that say about my faith? If I stay in this marriage, I'm convinced I'm not going to be happy. But if I leave, I lose so much more. If I go out drinking with the gang tonight, I might have fun. I'll probably end up doing some things I'm not very proud of. But if I head on home, I'm going to have a bad case of FOMO, the fear of missing out. You see, Joseph paused. He actually put the legacy question to himself and to Potiphar's wife. And the question is this: when you're making decisions, are you willing to hit pause and ask yourself, even if this is a hard decision to make, even if it goes against what I think I want, am I willing to write a better story? Is this the story I want to tell my kids, my coworkers, my spouse, that person that I'm hoping to share Jesus with one day? Is this the story I want to tell? Or is this going to be regret? Well, Joseph's story continues on into part 3. And here's what we're going to take from part 3. Is a well-written story will open doors. Keep that in mind. A well-written story will absolutely open doors. You see what happens here is Joseph has been doing the right thing, but he's thrown into jail. He's been accused unjustly. He spends the next 8 years in that dungeon. 8 years. Wondering, is anyone there? Does God know I'm here? Does anyone care? But what does he do? What's his attitude? He continues to apply the same attitude he did at Potiphar's. I'm going to work hard. I'm going to be trustworthy. I'm going to be a man of integrity. I'm going to do the right things. It says the other prisoners began to take notice. It says the warden of the prison began to take notice and started giving him some responsibility, administrative responsibilities. It wasn't long before he was running the prison as if he were the warden, and here he is a prisoner. Not to say he was where he wanted to be, but God was honoring where he was. Well, 8 years in, something interesting happens. A couple of pharaohs assistants get thrown into jail. There's a cupbearer and a baker get thrown into jail down there. And they're down there, and one night they have a dream. And they're talking about it over the meal, Joseph and the cupbearer and some of the other prisoners sitting around. And they begin talking about their dream. And they're like, we don't know what this means. And Joseph said, I can interpret that dream if you want me to. And he does. And so he tells the cupbearer, says, okay, me first. And so he tells him, he says, well, what your dream means is that you're going to be restored to your position with Pharaoh. It means that you're going to get everything back, and you're going to get to go back and work for him in a couple of days' time. Well, then the baker says, well, tell me mine. Interpret my dream for me. And he says, well, yours isn't quite as good. You're not going to get to go back in Pharaoh. As a matter of fact, he's going to cut your head off and impale you on a pole. Not exactly what he was looking for. But it's what happened. That's what happened to both of them. The vision came true. And so Joseph said, as the cupbearer is getting ready to go back to Pharaoh and to be with him, the cupbearer says, or Joseph says to the cupbearer, remember me. When you're back and restored with Pharaoh, I want you to remember me and put in a good report, because no one remembers that I'm even down here, and I'm not even down here for anything I did. Well, the cupbearer didn't. He goes back and he begins working for Pharaoh, and he forgets all about Joseph. 2 more years pass. He's been in jail now for 10 years, after 3 years in slavery in Potiphar's household. 13 years since his brother sold him into slavery. And one day Pharaoh has a dream, and it disturbs him. He can't find anyone to interpret this dream, and that's when the cupbearer remembers, there's a guy down there who can do this. And he tells Pharaoh about Joseph, and Pharaoh has Joseph brought to him, tells him the dream. And Joseph interprets it and says, here's what's going to happen. For the next 7 years, you're going to have prosperity. You're going to have grain flowing out of your ears. You're going to have so much prosperity. But at the end of that 7 years, a great famine is going to strike this entire part of the world. And for 7 more years, nothing will grow. Joseph keeps going. He says, I actually have a little advice for you too. If you will, for the next 7 years, store as much of your grain as you can, then you will become a hub for everyone in this part of the world being able to feed them during those years of famine. Pharaoh liked the idea so much, he decided to make Joseph number 2 in command of all of Egypt. This Hebrew slave has now just become number 2 in command in all of Egypt. And 7 years of prosperity go by. Joseph organizes everything, stores all the grain, and then famine hits, just like it was predicted. And they're prepared. And Joseph's in charge of distributing this grain to the entire world. Guys, if you will pause to ask the legacy question when making decisions, it will eventually open doors for you to be a significant part of God's upper story. You will find a purpose for everything that you're going through. You will find a purpose for your life. It took 13 years of good decision making in the midst of being sold into slavery by his brothers, working hard to only be framed of attempted rape and thrown in jail, working hard again only to be forgotten by the cupbearer before the door was finally open. Guys, I can't even struggle for a week before I'm whining to God. Why me? Why can't I pay my bills this week? Why? You know, and I find myself a week later wondering why I'm struggling. And I plug in all of it. We are all guilty of this. And Joseph, for 20 plus years, was struggling after this time of prosperity and famine, when 25 years have gone by. And he's saying, I don't know why I'm here. I don't have to like it, but I'm going to work hard and I'm going to stay focused because I trust that my God has a plan. And he may not reveal the answer. How many of us get tired of waiting? Well, if God hadn't answered me in a week or two, then I'm done with God. I'm going to find another way. A month has gone by. Well, that's enough suffering for me. I'm guilty of it. And here's Joseph saying, write a better story because you have no idea what doors are going to be open if you do. Guys, if you want to live without regret, if you want to see doors open in your life, every decision you make, focus on writing a better story. Sometimes we're called to struggle, and sometimes that struggle can last a long time. God doesn't enjoy our struggle, but he does want us to trust him, that the doors will open when it's time. And we finish the story here, part 4. Your story will impact countless others. That's called your legacy. What happens is now that Joseph and the Egyptians have this grain and the rest of the world starving, going back to Jacob and his other sons, Joseph's brothers, they've run out of food, and they've heard there's grain in Egypt. So Jacob sends the boys to go and to find out about this grain and to try to buy some. And when they come, it says Joseph sees them coming and recognizes them immediately. His brothers that sold him into slavery are now coming. What's he going to do? Great chance at revenge, right? 20 plus years of suffering, now it's time for me to get what's coming and to give it out. That's not how it plays. He eventually reveals himself and who he is to his brothers. They have an amazing family reunion to the point that the boys go back and get their dad, and they move them all right outside of Egypt to live, their family. And that's a huge piece of the entire story of the Bible. You see how the story of the Bible is lined up as we talked about God's covenant with Abraham, right? I promised to bring forth from you a great nation. And then Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob and Esau. Jacob is named Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel, they go to Egypt now because of this story with Joseph, where they will be for several hundred years and grow, and they will become the nation of Israel. And Moses comes on the scene and says, Pharaoh, let my people go, and leads them back out of the promised land and takes them back to where they're supposed to be. And then eventually Jesus comes onto the scene through this story. And the church comes from that. And us, we're a part of the story, guys. We're just listening to this story about Joseph. And it's not just Joseph's story. It's your story and my story too. We're all a part of it. It's all connected. Joseph had no idea when he was making the decision to be obedient, to write a better story, that his story would impact not just generations, but centuries. Would be a central piece of the entire story of the Bible. And your story is a part of that too. You have no idea how. You have no idea why what is happening to you right now is happening. But God's saying, if you will just trust me and be patient and make the decision every day to write a better story, to make that your legacy, you have no idea what doors will be open. You have no idea what God will do with you as a part of his upper story. But give him that chance. Write a better story with every decision you make. Andy Stanley says, when it feels like nothing we do matters, it's difficult to be concerned about what we do. When we couldn't care less because nobody else cares, we get careless. We make bad decisions. We create regret. And regret never makes for a good story. And guys, you can decide to start writing a story that you want to tell others without omissions, without regrets. You can begin writing that story right now, today. I love what Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 2. He says, friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. I'm going to ask the worship team to come on up. But as we pause, as we make decisions in our life every day, it's important to say, am I being honest with myself? I believe it's even more important to stop and say, what story do I want my life to tell? Do I really want God to use me in this story going forward? I don't know what kind of regret you brought in here today, But I can tell you this, God wants to use you in his story. And today you can start making better decisions with fewer regrets if you'll just pause and ask yourself these questions.